would the Civil War look like without the efforts of Harriet Tubman, or New York City without the rescue mission founded by Jerry McAuley? How did the lives of the thousands of children change with the love and care of Mother Teresa and Thomas Coram? It's really impossible to say, but there's no doubt that these examples of love in action accomplish the mission of leading people and hearts to Christ. Everyone at some point in their lives will come across someone in need. Much of history has been built on the shoulders of people who saw a need and responded. The Bible says that bearing one another's burdens fulfills the law of Christ. But knowing where to begin can be a daunting task. Needs come in many forms and faces. With so many needs to be met, it can often feel overwhelming to know how to make a difference, regardless of where you live. But starting somewhere, anywhere, is the first step in making a difference, no matter how small. One can of corn can lead to a full-blown food ministry. $1 can lead to someone turning their life around. And meeting one need can be the first domino in a chain reaction of change. In this month of September, we found some incredible stories throughout history of normal people who saw a need and responded with love in action. Our first story is about an ordinary girl named Agnes, born on August 26, 1910 in Macedonia. Her name in Albanian means pure, which would prove to be the fitting name for a girl who seemed early on to embody a heart of pure love for others. As a girl, Agnes was fascinated by stories she read of missionaries and their service in other parts of the world. These stories inspired her to see every unmet need as an opportunity to share God's love in action. At the early age of 12, Agnes decided to become a missionary herself. Little did she know that she would one day become one of the most famous missionaries of all time, Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa left Macedonia in 1928 at age 18. She traveled to Ireland and learned English with the intent of becoming a missionary in India. But throughout her life, she would become fluent not only in Armenian and English, but in Bengali, Serbian, and Hindi. After 1 year of training in Ireland, Teresa arrived in India to begin her missionary training in Darjeeling. There she learned Bengali and taught at a school near her convent. She took her first religious vows in May of 1931 and chose a new name, as was the custom. It would be a name that the entire world would one day recognize: Teresa, named after Teresa de Lisieux, the patron saint of missionaries. Sister Teresa then became a teacher at the Loreto Convent School in Entley, eastern Calcutta, where on May 24, 1937, at age 27, Teresa took her final profession of vows to a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Upon making her final vows, she took on the title Mother and thus became known as Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa served there for nearly 20 years and was appointed as its head mistress in 1944. Although she loved teaching at the school, she became increasingly disturbed by the terrible poverty in Calcutta. This was made even worse by the famine of 1943 and the Muslim-Hindu violence of 1946. Then, on September 10, 1946, Teresa took a train to Darjeeling for her annual retreat. While on the train from Calcutta to the Loreto Convent, Teresa experienced what she would later describe as the call within the call. It was a moment that would change her life. The inner call she heard was to leave the convent and to help the poor while living among them. Though nuns were known for their humanitarian work, most of them lived outside of the poverty and danger within their own convent. Mother Teresa felt that the voice she heard to leave the convent and live among the poor was a specific call from God, and that to fail would be to break the faith. She decided to respond with action.
Armed with 2 blue-bordered saris and her Bible, she left the school and began mission work with the poor in 1948. Teresa adopted Indian citizenship and received basic medical training at Holy Family Hospital before heading into the slums and living among the poor. She wrote in her diary that her first year on the field was filled with difficulty and hardship. With no income, she, like those who lived on the street, often had to beg for food and supplies. During this time, she experienced doubt, loneliness, and the temptation of returning to the comfort of convent life. She wrote,
"Our Lord wants me to be a free nun, covered with the poverty of the cross. Today I learned a good lesson. The poverty of the poor must be so hard for them. While looking for a home, I walked and walked till my arms and legs ached. I thought how much they must ache in body and soul, looking for a home, food and health. Then the comfort of Loreto came to tempt me. You have only to say the word and all that will be yours again." The tempter kept on saying, "A free choice, my God, and out of love for you, I desire to remain and do whatever be your holy will in my regard." I did not let a single tear come.
During this time, with greater empathy for hardships of the poor and homeless, she worked to found a school in Motijil, Kolkata for underprivileged children. This would serve as a base to begin reaching out to the poor and hungry within the community.
Though Mother Teresa started alone, it wouldn't be long before others heard and answered the call as well. She was soon joined in her efforts by a small group of young women who shared her heart to help the poorest among the poor. Together, they would become known as the Missionaries of Charity. Their efforts quickly caught the attention of many Indian officials, including the Prime Minister. In 1952, Teresa opened her first hospice with help from Calcutta officials. Converting a Hindu temple into the home of the pure heart, those brought into the home received medical attention and the opportunity to die with dignity in accordance with their faith. A beautiful death, as Teresa once said, is for people who lived like animals to die like angels, loved and wanted.
The Missionaries of Charity also established leprosy outreach clinics throughout the region, providing dressing, medication, and food to those who were seen as outcasts, along with opening a hospice for the elderly and dying called City of Peace. Due to the overwhelming amount of homeless children they came across, the sisters also opened the Children's Home of the Immaculate Heart as a haven for orphans and homeless youth.
By the 1960s, as word of their work spread, the Missionaries of Charity had begun to attract more recruits and donations, giving them the ability to open more hospices, orphanages, and leper homes throughout India. They soon expanded abroad, with a house in Venezuela, followed by houses in Italy, Tanzania, and Austria. Then, in the 1970s, the sisters opened houses and foundations in the United States, Asia, Africa, and Europe, their work literally spanning the globe. In recognition of the incredible missions work that Mother Teresa had accomplished, in 1979, she received the Nobel Peace Prize for work undertaken in the struggle to overcome poverty and distress, which also constitutes a threat to peace. But as was her nature, Mother Teresa refused the conventional ceremonial banquet for laureates, asking that the $192,000 it cost to be thrown instead be given to the poor in India. She believed that earthly rewards were important only if they helped her to help the world's needy.
When Teresa received the prize, she was asked, "What can we do to promote world peace?" Her answer, "Go home and love your family." She believed that the greatest hunger in the world was not that of bread or food. The greatest hunger was to be seen, wanted, and loved. She felt that though most people may not be able to feed the world, they could feed those that they came in contact with through love and compassion. They could feed one at a time, and combined, that can make the greatest difference.
Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love.
One of Mother Teresa's greatest acts of love is a story not as familiar to many. At the height of the Lebanon War in 1982, Teresa was called upon to rescue a group of children caught in the middle of the siege of Beirut.
On August 10th, Mother Teresa responded to a call relayed by Agence France Presse from Mother Coram, a horrified witness to 100 spastic and mentally challenged Muslim children abandoned by the staff of an orphanage located in the western part of Beirut. Though the staff was able to get some of them out, they had nowhere to take the rest, and those who were left there were now without food, care, medication, or hygiene. After numerous futile appeals to government agencies for help, Amal Makarem typed up an appeal to the world. She said of the letter, "It was a desperate SOS, a bottle into the sea. I gave it to Mauna Name, a journalist who later became my friend. The next day or two, I forget, a media miracle took place. The International Committee of the Red Cross called her and told her that they had received a call from the Vatican, who had heard the SOS, and it was Mother Teresa who would be heading over there to help the evacuation of the children. Mother Teresa arrived hurriedly in Lebanon, in a predominantly Christian part of the country outside of the war zone. When she arrived, she asked to see the ambassador of the United States, Philip Habib, known as one of the most outstanding professional diplomats of his time, who was sent there by President Ronald Reagan to help broker peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. According to witnesses, after listening intently to Mother Teresa, Philip Habib told her, "Mother, I am more than happy to have a woman of prayer at my side. I believe in the power of prayer. I believe that prayer is answered. I am a man of faith. But you see, you're asking Our Lady to deal with Prime Minister Begin. And do you not think that the time limit you gave him to order a ceasefire is a little short? You should maybe extend it a little?" Mother Teresa assured him that she firmly believed that they would have a ceasefire the following day.
The next day, August 14th, 1982, Mother Teresa had her miracle. The ceasefire negotiated by Philip Habib and obtained through Mother Teresa's faith was in place. Mother Teresa took action. At 72 years old, working with the Red Cross, she traveled throughout the war zone to the abandoned children, where she calmed and transported them out of harm's way into the safety of a convent. They would remain there until other arrangements could be made for their permanent care. Many touted the ceasefire and rescue a miracle and act of heroism. But for Mother Teresa, it was simply an act of love.
Love cannot remain by itself. It has no meaning. Love has to be put into action, and that action is service.
This wouldn't be the last time that Mother Teresa would put herself in harm's way to be love in action for those in need. She traveled to assist the hungry in Ethiopia, radiation victims at Chernobyl, and earthquake victims in Armenia.
By 1997, the 13-member Calcutta congregation had grown to more than 4,000 sisters who managed orphanages, AIDS hospices, and charity centers worldwide, caring for refugees, the aged, disabled, blind, alcoholics, the homeless and poor, and victims of natural disasters. Within 10 more years, the missionaries of charity numbered about 450 brothers and 5,000 sisters worldwide, operating 600 missions, schools, and shelters in 120 countries.
Mother Teresa's impact became further reaching than she could have ever imagined. She left out with her 2 saris with a simple mission to live among and love the poor. But fame was never her ambition. Love was her highest goal. And her love became a bright beacon of light to the world, leading the way for others to follow.
In Rome in 1983, while she was visiting Pope John Paul II, Teresa had a heart attack. Following a second one in 1989, she received an artificial pacemaker. Although Teresa offered to resign as head of the Missionaries of Charity at that time, in a secret ballot, the sisters of the congregation voted for her to stay, and she agreed to continue. But when her health continued to decline, on March 13, 1997, Teresa resigned as head of the Missionaries of Charity.
Mother Teresa once said, "By blood, I'm Albanian. By citizenship, I am Indian. By faith, I am a Catholic nun. As to my calling, I belong to the world. And as to my heart, I belong entirely to the heart of Jesus. 6 months after her resignation, that heart, which belonged entirely to Jesus, returned to him. As the woman who had shown the whole world love in action passed away this month in Christian history on September 5th, 1997. Because of Mother Teresa, today, the Society of Missionaries has continued to spread all around the world. Our next story takes place during the time that the evils of slavery still had its grip on America. A young woman took the torch of abolition and gave us an extraordinary example of what it looks like to put love into action.
In 1754, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends told its members to live in ease and plenty by the toil of those whom violence and cruelty have put in our power is neither consistent with Christianity nor common justice. By the 1770s, all of the Quaker yearly meetings in North America were united on the proposition that the enslaved had a natural and just right of liberty, and no Quaker should think to claim a human being as property. Slavery was, in Quaker eyes, a national evil. For Quakers, when religious duty came into conflict with the law of the land, it was the duty of the Christian to stand against it rather than obey. Pennsylvania Quaker William Jackson made this point in an 1846 pamphlet, writing, "No one is under any moral obligation to lend himself as a tool to others for the commission of a crime, even when commanded by his government to do the wrong. If you believe in the Golden Rule, what should you do when the fugitive comes to your door?" According to the Quakers' Christian principles, they were called to abide by the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do to you, and love your neighbor as you love yourself.
During this time, many of the Quakers participated in loosely organized Underground Railroad networks. A few even made the Underground Railroad their life's work, and it was widely believed that during that time, any escaped slave who crossed the Mason-Dixon line and came to the doorstep of a Quaker was either assisted or brought to someone who could help. For the Quakers, aiding and protecting those who escaped from slavery was simply Christian love in action.
But with all that the Quakers did for the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad, they certainly did not do it alone. In the Underground Railroad, it was the enslaved, the freedom seekers, and the freed slaves who took initiative and took action at the risk of their own lives.
One of the most famous Underground Railroad stories is that of Harriet Tubman. After experiencing the evils of slavery and witnessing her sisters being sold away, Harriet resolved that trying to escape with her brothers was a better option than being a slave.
Tubman had saved money and had made contact with someone within the Underground Railway, a network that provided safe houses and transportation for fugitive slaves. She strongly believed that God was with her in her endeavor and would guide her in her escape to freedom.
"'Twa'n't me, 'twas the Lord. I always told him, I trust to you. I don't know where to go or what to do, but I expect you to lead me." And he always did.
On September 17th, 1849, this month in history, Harriet Tubman headed out with her brothers on their escape to freedom. But soon, her brothers, afraid of the consequences of being caught, decided to go back. Harriet, however, was determined to reach freedom. There was no going back for her. She said, "There was one of two things I had the right to, liberty or death. If I couldn't have one, I would take the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for liberty as long as my strength lasted."
Harriet traveled at night so that she would not be seen by slave catchers. Just as other fugitives, such as Frederick Douglass, she followed the star that guided her north. The first person to help her was a Quaker woman who was part of the Underground Railway. She sheltered her for the first night and gave her instructions on her next steps to get across the Mason-Dixon line. North of that line were the Free States.
Her journey to freedom was nearly 90 miles. It's unclear how long it took her, but no matter how long, she was not turning back. She says of the moment she crossed that line,
When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven.
Harriet found her way to Philadelphia through the help of blacks and whites along the Underground Railway. When she arrived, she sought work as a domestic. Her plan was to save her money up so she could help the rest of her family escape.
In December 1850, Tubman took on her very first Underground Railroad mission. She would rescue her niece, Keziah Boley, and Boley's 2 children. Keziah's husband had already been freed, so together they turned to the maritime networks to help with the rescue. In a daring moment, John secretly stole his wife and their children from the auction block in Maryland and sailed them in a small boat to Baltimore, where Tubman waited to hide them.
By 1854, Tubman was fully involved in the Underground Railroad and abolitionist networks in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. In her next Underground Railroad mission, she returned to Baltimore alone and helped her youngest brother, Moses, escape. But she felt she needed to get more out at one time. She couldn't keep leaving so many behind. So, working with abolitionist and Underground Railroad friends like Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, Tubman ferried over 70 slaves, including all of her family and friends.
For others whom she could not go rescue herself, she gave detailed instructions for their escape and the locations of Quakers and freed slaves along the route. It is believed over 50 other slaves were freed by her efforts. Her dangerous rescue missions won the admiration of black and white abolitionists throughout the North who provided her with funds to continue. Many of those freed slaves joined the abolitionist movement and began helping others escape to freedom as well. The American Civil War erupted in April 1861 over the issue of slavery. Tubman assisted the Union's cause, which she saw as a path to the abolition of slavery. At first, she served as a nurse and a cook in the infirmary. Then, in 1863, after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Tubman's role in the war changed to scout and spy. Working with black Union soldiers, she led 150 of them in the Combahee River Raid. Through that raid, they were able to free more than 770 slaves. She was the only woman to lead an armed attack in the Civil War.
Overall, Tubman made about 19 rescue missions over a period of 11 years. She helped over 300 slaves escape to freedom, not including the Combahee River Raid. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison nicknamed her Moses, in reference to Moses who led the enslaved Hebrews out of Egypt. The men and women who all worked together for the cause of freedom put conviction and love into action. They lived lives that put the love of others above their own safety and their sacrifice above comfort. Our next story is of a man you've most likely never heard of. His name is Jeremiah McAuley. And well, Jerry was a pretty bad guy. He was born in Ireland in 1839. His mom couldn't care for him, his dad wasn't around, and he threw so many dirt clods at his grandma while she prayed that she shipped him off to his relatives in New York. In New York, he would one day go on to start the first ever American rescue mission. But before he did that, this young, street-tough, small-time criminal became a river thief.
At the age of 13, he ran away from home and took up life on Water Street. New York City in the 1850s was a turbulent place for a young teenager, and criminals soon became his new family. There was minimal policing, and you could make more money being in a gang than you could having an honest job. Teenage Jerry McAuley continued his training as a minor criminal and soon became a river thief, stealing whatever he could carry away from boats and waterfront warehouses. He would later write, "In the daytime, we went up into the city and sold our ill-gotten goods. and with the proceeds dressed up, then spent our time, as long as the money lasted, in the vice dens of Water Street, practicing all sorts of wickedness. On the streets, the teen became highly skilled as a fighter and became disliked not only by civil citizens, but by many of those on the street as well. Then, at 19, McAuley was accused of highway robbery. Though he pleaded innocent, the judge found him guilty and he was sentenced to 15 years at Sing Sing prison, notorious for housing the infamous death chair that performed a majority of all the electric chair executions at the time.
About 5 years later, into his sentence, one Sunday morning, McAuley heard a sermon given by a reformed criminal, Orville Gardner, who had been allowed to preach there at the prison. Gardner, more well known as Awful Gardner, had earned quite the reputation in New York as a bare-knuckle boxer. He was notorious for being one of New York's most ruthless characters inside and outside of the ring. Gardner was convicted of assault and battery and sentenced to 6 months in Sing Sing prison. After his release, he attended the revival of 1857 in New York City. This year-long revival is said to have brought over 1 million new converts into the American church, one of them being Gardner himself. After his conversion, he dropped the nickname Awful Gardner and became a preacher. Gardner converted many, including his brother Hal the Horrible Gardner, another notorious boxer who himself became an evangelist. Orville would visit prisons and minister to its inmates about the life-changing power of the gospel.
McAuley listened to Gardner's tearful testimony of reformation that Sunday and was convinced of the sincerity of the former criminal. McAuley began to read the Bible, though he could not tell any immediate transformation. Then one day he heard an inner voice direct him, "Pray." There in his small cell, he had a spiritual experience that left him with a conviction that his sins were forgiven and that he had become new. He said, "I was happy, for Jesus was my friend. My sins were washed away and my heart was full of love."
Feeling the call to evangelize himself, he had some success in converting others. McAuley's reformation was noticed in the prison, and a pardon was issued. On March 8, 1864, at 26 years old, the reformed river thief who was shipped off to New York by his grandma, Jerry McAuley, was set free. He left prison determined to lead a sober and spiritual life. But in an unfortunate event, he had a chance encounter with a friend from the past who persuaded him to try the new and harmless lager beer of the time. As a former alcoholic, it sent him spiraling into relapse. McAuley wrote in his biography,
"I drank it, and thus began my downfall. The old appetite was awakened. From that time I drank every day. Satan got completely the upper hand of me."
In a short time, McAuley returned to his old life of wrongdoing. After the Civil War, he and a partner acquired a boat, and the old river thievery was resumed.
One night, a fire aboard a ferry provided the perfect opportunity for looting. However, upon seeing the struggling passengers who had jumped from the flaming boat into the water, McAuley started a rescue mission. Unable to get away from the small inner voice, he was reconsidering his life of crime. Then one night, while too drunk to assist his partner, McAuley fell into the water and, knowing he was about to drown, heard a voice tell him to call on God, which he did.
I seemed to be lifted right up to the surface of the water, and the boat was brought right to me so that I could get hold of it. It always seemed to me a miracle.
This near-death experience did not leave McAuley. All of these God moments he had experienced throughout the years came together when he met a missionary one cold night. After hearing McAuley tell him how he made his money, the missionary offered to sell his coat to give McAuley the money instead, so he wouldn't have to go out on the river to steal again. This missionary's love in action affected McAuley in a powerful way. After bringing him the money from the coat, the missionary prayed with him, and from that moment, McAuley was finally moved to change the trajectory of his life once and for all. That example the missionary set was one McAuley wanted to live out himself, to be the one to help those in need.
McAuley finally secured honest employment. Then one day, as he was sitting at his work, he said God gave him a vision of working for the Lord. In the vision, he had a house and people were coming in. There was a bath, and as they came in, he washed and cleansed them outside, and the Lord cleansed them inside. He began to share the stream with others, not quite sure how to turn it into a reality. McAuley had another chance encounter with a businessman named Alfrederick Hatch, a Wall Street banker who had once been president of the New York Stock Exchange. Hatch was moved by McAuley's vision to establish, as he called it, the world's first rescue mission, where the drunkard was more welcome than the sober man, the thief preferred to the honest man, the harlot favored over the beautiful woman. Hatch donated a house at 316 Water Street for McAuley's vision. The funds were raised to refurbish the property, and America's very first rescue mission was founded.
Though the mission wasn't always well accepted in the area at first, housing the homeless, drunkards, and prostitutes, McAuley and his wife Maria, who had also been rescued from a life of degradation, were devoted to ministering to all who came to their door. Because McAuley was a well-known thief and drunkard in the area, many who came across his path were shocked to see the miraculous transformation.
One night, a man who had known McAuley during his darker days happened into the mission. He was shocked when he saw McAuley teaching and asked those around what they were doing there with him. They told him that McAuley had been converted. The man responded that he would rather believe the devil himself would have converted before McAuley. McAuley's new life and work soon became well known throughout New York. Many found Jesus at the mission and were helped in practical ways to get back on their feet and get their life on track. In 1912, the original mission building was torn down and a new 4-story building was erected. The shelter changed its name to the McAuley Water Street Mission. 10 rooms were opened for men. In 1927, the John Markle Dormitory was dedicated. During the 1960s, McAuley Water Street Mission moved to a new location. In 1882, McAuley left the rescue mission in good hands and founded the Cremorne Mission on West 32nd Street, which he conducted until his death.
On September 18th, 1884, this month in history, the river thief turned rescue worker Jeremiah McAuley passed away. His funeral brought people from all over New York City. The mission hall was packed to the brim. The best of saints and the most sinful all were there. As his wife Maria wrote in his biography, he had been one of the worst of men, but became one of the best, simply through the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. He loved others through the love that had been shown to him. In 2000, the rescue mission was renamed to its current name, the New York City Rescue Mission, and it continues to expand and reach more and more people every day. When you think of orphanages, you might think Oliver Twist or children sleeping in cold, dark rooms. But the truth is that orphanages were originally built out of compassion to take care of children in need. They were often the only place a child could go from the safety of the dangerous streets that they called home. For many centuries, there have been people and organizations that have specialized in the care of orphans. But it wasn't until the 18th century that the world would begin to see the overwhelming need to establish an institution of orphan care. One of the first orphanages was born in the heart of a sea captain who gave away an enormous fortune to see it become a reality.
Thomas Coram was born in Dorset, England in 1668. He was very fond of his parents, whom he spoke of highly. However, at a very young age, his mother passed away. His father, who was believed to be a master mariner, traveled often, and when young Coram was 11, his father helped him get a job at sea. Due to his early apprenticeship, young Coram never received a proper education. This lack of a formal education would later become a catalyst for his philanthropic endeavors throughout his later life. In the early 1690s, a London merchant hired Coram to voyage to colonial America and oversee the supply of cheap merchant ships for the growing cross-Atlantic trade. After working for the London merchant for several years, Coram moved to Taunton, Massachusetts, which had been founded by members of the Plymouth colony, to establish his own shipyard. There, he married the love of his life, Eunice Waite.
Though Coram was considered to have the typical rough edges of a sea captain, he was also known as a man of conviction and compassion. Coram was an advocate of fairness and equality. He felt that all people were created equal and were meant to take care of their fellow man. It was well known that the couple aided and promoted the rights of Native Americans with whom they lived and worked.
At one time, when two Mohicans went to London to apply to the king for redress after their people had been defrauded of their land, Coram took up their case and argued fiercely for them. Coram also went against the culture of the time in his advocacy for the education of girls, whether Native American or British. He believed they should have the same rights as any boy, and he would continue to champion this belief throughout his life in numerous ways. In December 1703, he gave 59 acres of land in Taunton to the Anglican Episcopal Church to be used for a church and schoolhouse established by Britain. However, many of Coram's neighbors did not welcome his loyalty to the British crown, nor his Anglican faith. Religious and political differences soon surfaced.
In 1704, at the age of 36, Coram and his wife returned to London. There he would continue to try to shape the new colonies to have the ideals and principles he wished to see in his own home of England, those of faith, equality, and second chances.
He suggested a colony be founded in South Carolina specifically for the poor, for those who needed a fresh start. He worked with James Oglethorpe, social and prison reformer, on this proposition, who eventually founded the colony of Georgia. Thomas Coram's knowledge and experience in the new colonies were invaluable. Coram worked hard to make the new settlement, Georgia, a success. He raised funds and attended meetings regularly as plans were made. His biggest points of disagreement were over the idea of allowing slavery in the colony. Coram was a big opponent of slavery and their refusal to allow women equal rights of inheritance in the new colony. He believed this to be unfair and a deterrent for families. Coram won both battles, and of the latter, it was written that Captain Coram, who was violent for female succession, was much pleased with the intended act. Unfortunately, as the colony began to be run by others, things shifted from Coram's original ideals.
Soon, Thomas Coram turned his attention toward the work needed to be done on his own doorstep. He and his young wife, Eunice, were unable to have children, and so began to invest in work that was dear for both of them, focusing on care and education of children in need.
Though booming economically in the late 18th century, London had become a noisy and polluted city of industry and invention. The disparity between the upper and lower classes had grown significantly, and the situation for children living in poverty was particularly bleak. Many ended up working long hours in factories or workhouses, or turning to professional begging and thievery. Due to rampant sickness and hunger, some children died in those environments. After Coram and his wife had returned to England, they had become increasingly alarmed at the amount of unloved, destitute, and dying children on London's streets. They felt that something must be done, and they could be the ones to do it. Coram decided to petition the king for a charter to build a foundling hospital supported by patrons to protect these children. But this proved difficult. It seemed impossible to gain the backing of anyone influential enough. In 18th century England, there was a strong stigma towards children born illegitimately, and a belief that supporting vagrant parents who did not have the ability or desire to raise their own children would only perpetuate the problem.
However, Coram was determined to fight for a place for these children on the street. For 17 years, Coram and his wife worked to find a way to make it happen. Since the idea was rejected by the British male aristocracy, Coram turned to the leading men's spouses instead.
His first target was the young Duchess of Somerset, who was married to Charles Seymour, the richest man in England. Her husband had already refused Coram's idea for the orphanage, so supporting such a cause would be going against her husband in a somewhat public way. However, moved by Coram's plea for the plight of these children and the action needed to be taken to relieve them of their suffering, the Duchess graciously signed the petition. This started a domino effect, and over time, 20 other duchesses, baronesses, and countesses followed her example, convincing their husbands to do the same. At a later court, accolades were given to Coram, who requested that thanks be given to the ladies of quality and distinction who had been willing to step up for the children.
The first stone of the foundation of the Foundling Hospital, England's first home for children, was laid on September 16th, this month in history, in 1742. Thomas Coram's idea for his charitable institution that would take in unwanted children and give them the care and education they needed had finally become a reality. It would be called Foundling Hospital, a place of hospitality and healing. All of the children brought into the home were given entirely new identities. Wherever they had come from or whatever they had been through could all be left behind. This was an opportunity for them to have a fresh start on life.
The home provided shelter, food, clothing, medical care, and education for both boys and girls, as Coram insisted, but it also involved much of the London community. Instrumental in the support of Coram's dream were several artists, the most famous, English painter William Hogarth, and the composer George Friedrich Handel. With their help, the public was made more aware of the charity and garnered even further support in the community. Like the Corams, Hogarth and his wife were also childless. Hogarth became one of the founding governors, along with designing the school's coat of arms and fostering a number of the children in their own home. Hogarth also came up with the idea to set up a permanent art exhibition at the Institute, encouraging other leading artists of the day to donate art pieces as well, which not only brought attention to the charity, but unknowingly at the time, established the UK's first public art gallery. Handel donated an organ and conducted annual benefit concerts of Messiah and a specially composed choral piece, the Foundling Hospital Anthem, in the hospital's chapel to help raise needed funds. Their combined efforts paved the way for creative arts supporting philanthropy today. From the benefactors and artists who helped financially support the Institute, to the wet nurses and clergy who took care of the infants, to the families who took in the children as apprentices, many in the community became involved in the mission of Foundling Hospital.
Year by year, the orphanage began to grow as children were brought to its doors, most as infants. Between January 1750 and December 1755, 783 children were taken in. And by 1763, so many children had been brought to the home that eventually admission required applicants to provide their name and circumstances, rather than just being able to anonymously drop off a child. Though the organization wasn't perfect and some issues arose, Coram tried to set up checks and balances to keep an eye on the logistics of the organization and the treatment of the children.
In fact, Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, which portrays the plight of the orphan and orphan care at that time, gave a kind nod to Foundling Hospital. The orphanage was very close to Doughty Street, where Dickens and his family were living while he was finishing Oliver Twist. On Sundays, Dickens used to worship in the Foundling Chapel with his family. In Dickens' novel, he writes of a compassionate and important character who saves Oliver from prison and the book's villains, Mr. Brownlow, the same name of Foundling Hospital's secretary, Mr. Brownlow, a man who is an orphan himself, grew up at Foundling Hospital and went on to work at the charity for 58 years. The charity was eventually taken over and led by others, but throughout Thomas Coram's life, he continued his work of children's rights, education, and women's equality. When the ship captain passed away on March 29, 1751, at the age of 83, he was buried in the chapel of the Foundling Hospital. Years later, a statue was erected in his honor with an inscription calling him a pioneer in child welfare.
At Thomas Coram's passing, there would still be much work to do in the continual reformation of child labor and orphan care. However, Coram had done more than anyone to bring awareness to the plight of unwanted children. In the early 1900s, due to the industrial boom, almost half of the factory workforce were younger than 20. In rural areas, children as young as 5 or 6 worked in fields away from their homes.
Thomas Coram and his wife had a vision to love the unloved and take action where many had turned a blind eye. Because of this, from 1741, when the first babies were admitted, to 1954, when the last student was placed in foster care, the Foundling Hospital cared for and educated nearly 25,000 children. The Thomas Coram Foundation for Children still works with children and young people across the UK and beyond today. At the turn of the century and throughout the 1900s, laws and regulations that protected and provided for orphans and child welfare can be attributed to the legacy of Thomas Coram.
James 1:27. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to constantly work alongside and for orphans and widows in their affliction, despite any costs. What would the Civil War look like without the efforts of Harriet Tubman? Or New York City without the rescue mission founded by Jerry McAuley? How did the lives of the thousands of children change with the love and care of Mother Teresa and Thomas Coram? It's really impossible to say, but there's no doubt that these examples of love in action accomplish the mission of leading people and hearts to Christ. So, whenever we see a need, I hope that these stories inspire us to step up and be the one to change a life by putting God's love into action. I hope you've enjoyed looking back at what happened this month in Christian history. What I love about studying the past is that one moment in time can open up loads of incredible history. No matter how much life we've lived, we can all learn so much from the believers that have gone before us. The peaks and valleys that they endured can prepare us to pioneer our own paths. But most of all, they can inspire us to trust in the God who holds all of history in his hands. I'm Cody Crouch. I hope you'll join me next time on This Month in Christian History. Until then, go make some history of your own.